Margaret Kensington, a wealthy and influential woman known throughout London for her family's vast fortune and impeccable reputation, lay still in the grand bed of her Kensington mansion. The silk sheets rustled as her shallow breath fought against the weight of illness that had been consuming her for weeks. Doctors from the most prestigious hospitals had visited, offering little more than grim assessments and feeble hopes of recovery. The prognosis was bleak. There wasn't a cure in sight, and Margaret had begun to accept that the end was near. She had always lived a life of opulence, surrounded by the finest things money could buy, yet none of it seemed to matter now. The walls, adorned with art from across the globe, felt like a mockery of her situation. Gold, diamonds, power, none of it could save her from death's imminent embrace. Evelyn Jones, the housekeeper, quietly entered the room. She had worked for the Kensington family for over 10 years, a quiet, diligent woman who had come to know the mansion better than anyone. Unlike the rest of the household staff, who always kept a respectful distance from Margaret, Evelyn had a different relationship with her employer. She wasn't afraid of the cold exterior that Margaret often projected. In fact, Evelyn had seen glimpses of vulnerability in her, hidden beneath layers of sophistication and pride. She wasn't just the woman who cleaned the rooms. She had been there during difficult moments, overhearing the conversations that no one else in the house paid attention to, and she knew that Margaret was scared. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the room, Evelyn noticed something unusual in Margaret's breathing. It was erratic, shallow, and each breath seemed like it could be her last. Panic rose in Evelyn's chest. None of the doctors were present, and the nurses had retired for the night. She moved swiftly to Margaret's side, unsure of what to do but knowing that she couldn't simply stand by and watch her die. Evelyn didn't have medical training, but she had spent years caring for her own ailing mother and had learned a few things along the way. She quickly propped Margaret up, loosened the restrictive silk nightgown, and, in a desperate attempt, began performing a simple yet firm chest compression, hoping that something, anything, would stir life back into the weakening woman. At first, nothing happened. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, her hands moving automatically in rhythm. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Margaret coughed, her eyes fluttering open for a brief second before closing again. But her breathing became steadier. Evelyn let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her. She sat beside Margaret, her hands trembling, not from the physical exertion, but from the realization that she had just saved the life of a woman whose death seemed inevitable only moments before. Margaret's face, pale and gaunt, looked peaceful now, her body easing into a more regular rhythm of breaths. The crisis seemed to have passed. The next morning, Margaret awoke, groggy and confused, her mind trying to make sense of the events from the previous night. The room was still bathed in the soft glow of early morning light, and she noticed Evelyn sitting quietly in the corner, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Margaret blinked a few times, her throat dry and scratchy. "What happened?" she croaked, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn stood, her movements careful and measured. She approached the bed, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and relief. "You were fading, ma'am. I did what I could," she said softly, not wanting to alarm her. Margaret's mind was hazy, but she vaguely recalled the sensation of Evelyn's hands on her chest, the pressure, the frantic feeling of being pulled back from the brink of death. "You saved my life?" Margaret asked, incredulity creeping into her voice. Evelyn nodded, her expression modest, as if what she had done was a routine task and not a miraculous intervention. Margaret stared at her for a long moment, processing this revelation. She had never seen Evelyn as anything more than part of the background, a fixture in the household who kept things running smoothly. But now, Evelyn was something else entirely, the person who had prevented her from slipping away into the unknown. "I don't know what to say," Margaret whispered, her pride making it difficult to express gratitude, but the sincerity in her tone was undeniable. Evelyn smiled faintly, bowing her head in acknowledgement before stepping back. "It's all right, ma'am. I'm just glad you're still with us." The day went on in a blur, and as the hours passed, Margaret regained more of her strength, though the memory of that close call haunted her thoughts. She found herself thinking about Evelyn more than usual, this woman who had been in her employ for years, yet who she had never really known. There was something remarkable about her calm, her composure in such a critical moment. Margaret had always prided herself on being self-sufficient, but now she realized how utterly reliant she had become on those around her. People like Evelyn who made her world function. But as the evening fell, a strange unease settled over the mansion. The air felt thick with tension, though no one could pinpoint why. Margaret felt it too, an inexplicable sense of dread that gnawed at the edges of her consciousness. She tried to shake it off, attributing it to the lingering effects of her illness. She retired to her room early, hoping that a good night's sleep would ease her restlessness. That night, however, was anything but restful. Margaret awoke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, her heart racing as though she had been running. The room was deathly silent, but something felt off. She glanced around, her eyes adjusting to the darkness, and that's when she saw it. Evelyn, standing in the doorway, watching her. Margaret blinked, her breath catching in her throat. "Evelyn?" she called out, her voice shaky. Evelyn didn't move. She stood there, her expression unreadable, her hands clasped in front of her. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice growing more insistent. Still, Evelyn didn't respond. Margaret's pulse quickened, and she struggled to sit up, but her body felt heavy, uncooperative. Fear gripped her as she realized she couldn't move. Her limbs were stiff, her muscles refusing to obey her commands. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice soft yet chilling in its calmness. "You should have let go," she whispered. Margaret's mind raced, confusion and terror battling for dominance. "What do you mean?" she gasped, her voice barely audible. Evelyn stepped closer, her silhouette dark against the dim light. "I saved you," she continued, her tone matter of fact. "But maybe I shouldn't have. Maybe it was your time." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to make sense of Evelyn's words. "You saved my life," Margaret managed to say, her voice trembling. Evelyn nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Margaret's. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But death doesn't like to be cheated." Margaret's breath hitched as the weight of Evelyn's words sank in. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but her voice failed her. She watched in horror as Evelyn slowly backed out of the room, disappearing into the shadows. The door closed with a soft click, and Margaret was left alone, paralyzed by fear. The night stretched on endlessly, and Margaret lay there, unable to move, unable to shake the feeling that something terrible was coming for her. The next day, when the sun finally rose, the staff found Margaret lying in her bed, her eyes wide open, frozen in a silent scream. She was alive, but something inside her had changed. The spark that once defined her was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness. Evelyn went about her duties as usual, but from that day forward, there was a distance between her and the rest of the household. Whispers began to circulate among the staff, stories of strange occurrences, of eerie presences in the mansion at night. Some claimed to hear footsteps in the halls when no one was there. Others spoke of doors opening and closing on their own. Margaret never spoke of what had happened that night, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. Evelyn remained by her side, silent and watchful, and though Margaret owed her life to the housekeeper, she could never quite shake the feeling that her life had been taken in some other way, that Evelyn's intervention had not been a gift, but a curse.